Welcome everybody. We are so glad that you could join us live for today's workshop with Elliot Smith. Hi, Elliot. It's so
Hello.
nice to have you on. This is going to be such a very much needed topic, finding peace in the storm, coping with anxiety. I am so glad that you could do this workshop for us today. So before I turn it off over to you, Elliot, I want to actually share with everyone your bio. So Elliot is the manager for the spiritual care department at the Kettering Main Hospital. He joined that department in 2017. He is an ordained minister. He holds a master's in social work and has experience as an individual and group therapist. And one thing I'm going to add that he did not tell me in his bio, and I know that just because I know Elliot, is he is one of our board of trustees for the Ardmore Institute of Health, which is home of Full Plate Living. So not only does he do all these wonderful things, he does a lot for our nonprofit, and we greatly appreciate for that from him as well. So Elliot, I will turn it over to you. I'm going to pop off, but if you need anything, just holler at me. And as I said, everyone, join us in the chat.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you for everybody who's joining. I am so just honored to be in this type of forum. It's really neat in terms of just seeing names on the side there. I appreciate that a lot. And like she said, please put your questions there. I'd be happy to go to those in the question and answer after this presentation. As Amy said, I've got kind of a dual background of starting in social work. And that social work brought me into my master's of social work degree, where I focused on individual and family therapy, but also ministry, and moved into the ministry field. And those kind of blended each other. And now in hospital chaplaincy, I'm really finding that it's a really interesting blend working in a hospital like we are. We're a tertiary hospital, about a 400-bed hospital in Dayton, Ohio, suburb of that of Kettering. And one of the things that I will say is that I was always aware as a therapist and as a pastor is that anxiety was a problem that more people than we know face and struggle with. One of the things I also knew is that there was a lot of confusion regarding anxiety, because many times people will either mistake anxiety for something they have to see a doctor for because they feel anxious. And on the other side, people who feel anxious and say, well, this isn't something medical. I just need to tough it up and just deal with this. And so one of the things that I want to try in this presentation is, number one, clarify what clinical anxiety is, things that you probably should see a medical professional for, versus what is called everyday anxiety, something that you could certainly see professional help for, but also something that everybody faces. And there are some foundational steps that we can get to building a support structure in your life where you can withstand those storms. And that's the first image I wanted to share with you, is that we all go through storms. Working in the healthcare field, like maybe some of you, we experienced the COVID pandemic as one of the greatest storms, at least in certainly my life, in terms of hitting the healthcare field, where we saw unprecedented issues when it came to patient illness, what that did to families in our community, social isolation, also what it did to healthcare providers, the crises of anxiety, of you name it. It hit so many people that it was a tremendous storm. And you don't have to live very long. I've got an 18-year-old daughter who is going to be graduating high school this weekend. And in her short life, she has already experienced storms. Storms when it comes to issues in school with her academics not being what she wished. Also dynamics when it came to friendships and relationships that don't go the way you want them to. She had some physical issues, medical issues, where she wasn't planning on these things, and they caused a storm in her life of, can I do what I used to do or thought I could do physically when I'm not able to due to this illness? We're all going to find these storms in our life, and I think that's one of the things that we sometimes don't want to recognize, is we just want to pretend that life is going to be good, and we should be optimistic, and that is certainly a very good mindset to have, optimism. But I don't think it's also necessarily bad to say that you do need to prepare for storms. You do need to understand that there will be challenges, and we're best fit to know how to handle these challenges. And one of the things I think that we do when we try to look at preparing ourselves is the importance of developing foundations in your life. I picked this picture because to me it just is a perfect example of the importance of building foundations, as we say, on solid ground. As you can see from this house, the foundations are sand. And I can just imagine the individual who had this house had the house because it was beautiful. I could just imagine this is looking out on the sea, a beautiful way to just simply step off your porch and be right there in the ocean. And many times we do look at life where we want to get as comfortable as we can be, that we want to be as easy of a life as we can be. But at the same time, are we truly setting foundations in our life so that when storms come, as I said before, they will, our house won't topple over? What I mean by that is our life. What are the foundations that you have that won't change depending on circumstances, that won't change depending on what job you have, or what happens in your family, or what happens in your society or your community? I'm not going to say that this is easy. I'm not going to say that this is simple, but I'm going to tell you we have hope and we have an ability to support each other through this. And that's what I want to present to you today. The first thing I want to look at, as I said before, is this issue of clinical anxiety. As a social worker, I worked in health situations where I would help physicians diagnose people with clinical anxiety. And one of the things you need to understand, and this comes from the DSM manual, is there are certain qualifications that anxiety has to reach in order for it to be considered clinical, in other words, diagnosable. And some of the common, if you want to say general categories, is that this anxiety has to be something that is consistent. It doesn't come and go. 1 week you're fine, 1 week you're not fine. 1 week the anxiety is overwhelming and the next week it's manageable. But this is something that is constant, is always with you. It also is going to be something that would cause you to withdraw. And that could be something where you're emotionally withdrawing, where you're just being silent. It could be a physical withdrawal. And this is something that is painful to see in loved ones, where they just simply, you would call hibernate. They go away. And I would say, just as a caveat here, is that sometimes it's confusing to differentiate between what is depression and what is anxiety. And I will say, as a clinician, it wasn't terribly uncommon for those to blend together. In other words, it wasn't uncommon for someone to have anxiety blended with depression. And that's something we could talk about at another time, but that's not terribly uncommon. The other thing that you would say clinical anxiety does is, as a must to be diagnosable, is that anxiety is going to interfere with what you normally do. And that goes back to the isolation. It goes back to unrelenting. And so this is the dynamic that we have, where we look at, I'm not able to do the things I used to. Maybe it was hobbies that I simply can't do because this anxiety, this pressure, this fear, and we'll go through some of the other symptoms in a minute, but it's just preventing me from enjoying the things I used to enjoy. This is an example of one of the common anxiety diagnoses, and some of these have a lot to do with other types of specific anxieties. One of the anxiety disorders that you may be familiar with is a panic attack, something that you experience over a discrete. In other words, this is something isolated to a period of time, but it's an intense fear. Maybe some people describe it, I know, where it's a physical fear, something that comes over that they say is in their mind, or their body even starts to have these feelings. And you can see here some of the symptoms are palpitations, the heart begins to accelerate, physically sweating, trembling, shortness of breath, chest pain, nausea, abdominal distress, feeling dizzy, feeling losing control, or like they're going crazy. Maybe it could be a fear of dying, the numbing or tingling in the hands or the feet, hot flashes, chills. These are all symptoms that as a clinician you look at, and if you see these in a person, you would say this isn't just your everyday anxiety. This is something that's clinical. And I will say, as a clinician, what is really, I think, agreed upon by all medical providers is that the best form of treatment for someone who has anxiety or depression or some other mental illnesses is always going to be a combination of pharmaceutical, in other words, medical, as well as talk therapy, in other words, a therapist. I will also say, and because I'm a believer in this, and as Amy said, I'm part of the Ardmore Institute of Health, is I believe there's also a dynamic that comes into this where we have to look at the holistic treatment. And we'll talk about that later in terms of looking at our system and building foundations that don't just have to do with the right medication or perhaps getting the right therapist, but also to look at some things in our life that we can do ourselves. And that has to do with building a foundation so that we're able to withstand some of the circumstances that might bring on anxiety. The big picture I want to give you here is that despite all the different diagnoses that fall under that umbrella of anxiety, again, they have some things in common. Clinical, they are persistent. In other words, they go over a long period of time. They don't come and go with circumstances. And again, typically the persistency is the overwhelming fear or worry that begins to hamper everyday life, whether through isolation or other changes in patterns. Also, the frequency and intensities of these fears are so, you would say, disruptive to a person that, again, it is inhibiting their normal life when it comes to either relationships, it could come to work, or it could come to hobbies. These are the clinical types of anxiety that, again, I want to emphasize. If you or a loved one are feeling some of these things, I urge you to talk to someone to get help. A medical provider would be able to help you, as I said, with the pharmaceutical, doing tests. And one of the things I want to tell you here is that there are some medical conditions that can mimic or even cause anxiety. And you look at the list here. In other words, some of those conditions that I mentioned before, let's say with panic disorder, where you had all those physical symptoms, sometimes those physical symptoms could be signs of a medical condition. And I have them listed here: sleep disorder, epilepsy, heart conditions, migraines, diabetes, thyroid disease. I'm not a physician, but I have seen these with patients, that sometimes a medical condition can be the cause of the anxiety, or at least the signs of anxiety. So therefore, by treating the medical condition appropriately, you're also treating the anxiety symptoms. Now, that's not in all cases. Sometimes anxiety is a standalone issue, a mental health issue, but sometimes it is blended with physical or medical issues that also have to be addressed. And this is why, again, I say, find a good family practice. Find someone that you can talk to about the medical side, the physical side, as well as maybe address some of these mental concerns that you have. Well, here's to me where the rubber meets the road. Is anxiety a condition, in other words, a mental illness, or is anxiety simply a normal reaction? In other words, is it something that everybody has? Well, I want to give you a definition here from Webster's Dictionary that defines anxiety as the body and mind's reaction to stressful, dangerous, or unfamiliar situations. Think about that for a second. Stressful, dangerous, or unfamiliar. Maybe just go back in your life for the last week or 2 weeks and think in your life, have you had any stressful, dangerous, or unfamiliar situations? And if so, do you find that you experienced anxiety? And anxiety, like I referenced before, could be a feeling that's physical, feeling out of breath, your heart's racing, you're sweating. Sometimes it's mental, where you're finding that it's hard to maintain a constant thought, you're easily distracted. Well, I would argue the answer to this question is yes. Yes, it is a condition that anxiety sometimes rises to a level where it's clinical, but sometimes I think anxiety is a very normal reaction. And I'll give you an example here in the medical field. When we have medical providers who respond to an emergency, and this could be anything from emergency medical providers, for instance, an ambulance who goes to a scene of an accident. This could be a police officer or fire officer who goes to the scene of a shooting or an accident. Or it could be a nurse or a physician who sees a patient brought in from those accidents or shooting in the hospital setting. What we find is that sometimes, even when someone is used to these environments where maybe the stress level doesn't come up, but because maybe it's a little bit unfamiliar from situations before, or perhaps there's a danger or a reminder of something, is that they could go through what we would call a serious stressful event. And what we do in the hospital setting is we debrief with staff and we talk about the importance of recognizing that these normal activities that they do every day as their job, and by the way, I want to say they're heroes because this is their everyday job, is that this is a dynamic that we need to help them understand that even though it's every day, even though it's normal, it's an anxiety that can build up. And unless you have those foundations, and again, I'm hitting on this, as you can tell, unless you have those abilities to cope in a healthy way, that everyday anxiety can build and build and build to a point that it begins to harm you, that it begins to harm you physically, it begins to harm you emotionally, it begins to harm you spiritually, and will impact your life so that it gets to that clinical stage. And we don't want to see people get to that. We want to see our staff be able to cope in such a way that those everyday anxieties that happen, that are stressful, sometimes dangerous, sometimes unfamiliar, you can't avoid them, but you can learn to cope with them in a healthy way. The sources of anxiety, I would say, come from two different, if you want to think of them, angles. One is the external, and I mentioned that with healthcare work or EMS or police or fire. They walk into stressful environments. The environment itself is anxious or anxiety producing. Maybe someone is in an accident. Maybe someone has a medical illness, and just the news of that medical illness of you or a loved one causes anxiety. But there's also sources of anxiety, and this is, I think, the trickier, that can be internal. And again, working in therapy like I did, this is what we talked a lot about with patients and with families, is talking about all those internal messages that are going on in our minds, those voices that tell us we're not good enough, those voices that tell us we'll never be able to pass the class, or we're not smart enough, or that no one likes us. Those are the internal voices, I would say, that also can cause anxiety, or the source of anxiety. And so when I'm talking to people, and this is what I guess I'm addressing to you as you think about your own anxiety or maybe a loved one's anxiety, what's the source of anxiety? Is it internal or is it external? Perhaps sometimes it can be both. You could have an external event that is challenging. Let's say the stressful experience of trying to pass a final exam. That's an external event. But along with that is the internal voices of perhaps feelings of doubt in self, or feelings of alienation because of something going on in your life, and you just don't feel like you're capable of doing it. And because of that, you're feeling more anxious and more stressed. So sometimes it's both, but I would argue many times it's greater on one side than the other. And this is sometimes something you need to sit down and you need to simply write out. In other words, get a piece of paper and try to define, if I'm feeling anxious, what are the sources of my anxiety? Is it something outside of me that's making me feel anxious? Or is it something inside of me, something that I'm telling myself or that I'm fearful of? Is that where the source of my anxiety is? Try to clarify that. If you want to build a foundation, and this is where we get to the construction work of life, I would argue that the first step for anyone is to form a foundation, the bottom level of your stability in life, in identifying your faith, your purpose, or your identity. Now, I want to say very, very plainly here that I am a Christian. And so as a Christian, my faith, my experience with God is part of my foundation. But I also want to say, if you don't associate with any religious belief, that it's still an ability of yours to form a foundation around the idea of what is your purpose in life? What do you feel called to do? And maybe part of that is, who are you called to be? And again, these are deep issues that I would argue aren't something you could simply decide in a day, but it certainly is something you can prioritize in life. It's certainly something that you could choose to say, maybe I'm not sure on these things. Maybe I have faith, but I'm not really sure how that interacts with my life, especially as it relates to an ability to withstand those storms. Well, maybe that's something you need to identify as steps to work on. Or maybe it's part of a purpose, that maybe you're in a situation of life where you're changing careers and suddenly your purpose is shifting. You feel called to do one thing, and because the job ended prematurely, now you're having to redefine your purpose. Again, that's part of building a foundation. And I would argue that that foundation is hopefully something that won't change with circumstances. In other words, that idea that I said where your job changes, the importance is understanding that whether or not my job changes, maybe I have a purpose that gives me strength and a foundation that says, no matter what job I'm doing, I know this is what I was put on this earth to do. Maybe it's helping people. Maybe it's helping people in a specific group. Maybe it's helping people in a specific area. I know that working as a social worker, for a long part of my life, I felt called to help children from dysfunctional homes and families. And no matter what job I was doing, whether I was working for the state or a private practice or wherever it might be, that was my purpose. That's what I felt called to do. And I could do that in any number of circumstances or any number of jobs. So the job didn't matter as much to me as being able to fill that purpose of my life at that time. And I would hope for you that maybe you've been able to identify that. And sometimes we do that through school. But I would argue that sometimes schools aren't great with helping us find that purpose. They're good with helping us gain skills and knowledge. But that idea of identity and purpose is something deeper, something that you have to sit down and talk over maybe your best friend or a family member with, to really help you understand, what do I really feel called to do? When I look at my life, what are the things that I've always loved to do? And how does that guide me in making decisions that won't change with my job or won't change with whom I'm around? This is what I feel called to do. That's foundational. The next thing, and this kind of goes with number one, is the next layer of the foundation is to seek out community and connections. Hopefully you saw, like I did, that one of the greatest parts of the storm of COVID is that in many ways it separated us. It caused us all to go like this. Everything was done online, schools, churches, work. And while it was certainly a nice tool to enable us to connect over distances or because of social distancing, what I find is that the remnants of that time period where we were separated has caused, in some ways, horrendous impacts, especially on children and young adults. I know as a parent of 2 children, I found that that time period wasn't just harmful for them academically, in other words, making them learn in a new way, but I found that that lack of social connection, being with people face to face, really hurt their spirits. And I think it's something that we need to look at in terms of how are we intentionally making sure that we are plugging into someone or a group of someone's. If you remember, I talked about that one of the symbols of clinical anxiety is separating or isolating yourself. And that to me is the double-edged sword of something like anxiety or depression, is that what you need is the connection, but what you're feeling is you don't want the connection. And so to me, that is the most harmful thing about these things, is that in one way, we're naturally being pulled to be by ourselves, when in actuality, the foundational principle that would help us heal is to form connections with people. And again, I would just encourage you to think about this, that this doesn't happen overnight either. This is not something that's easy. For some people, maybe the extroverts of you out there, it's fairly easy. But I would argue even for extroverts, it's really hard to form those connections that are truly meaningful, where you do life together with people. And there certainly is an ability to do this in faith communities, in churches or mosques or temples or those kind of things where you have that commonality of faith. But it's also something you can do with things that aren't maybe that you would think of as naturally. I'll always remember a patient that I had here in the hospital, and I'm just going to call him Bob. And Bob was here because he had cancer. In fact, he had end-stage cancer. And so he was here for the end of his life. And I had a chance to sit down several times and talk to him about how is he coping with this? What is he seeing in his life as the greatest loss or the greatest opportunities? And in talking to him, he quickly identified that he was not a person of faith. He didn't have any connection to religion. But as I talked further and we talked about meaning and purpose, he quickly lined up on, he said, you know what? I got that from my bike club. And I remember saying, Bob, what are you talking about? Is this like something you go to at a restaurant and a bar? He said, no. Every Sunday morning, I got together with the same 15 or 16 people, and we went riding together every Sunday morning for 20 plus years. And as he described it, I immediately thought of this, that for him, in a sense, this was almost his spiritual connection. Again, he said he wasn't religious, but I would argue what he was doing was an ability to connect with people on a spiritual level, a purpose level, but also this number 2, it was a community connection that brought him strength in other areas of his life. And I remember he talked about this as he went through the final days of his life. And in fact, those were the people that saw him and visited him, in addition to family, was the members of his bike club. And I saw firsthand how that enabled him to have strength to go through cancer and to go through the end stages of life because of the support he had with people who shared that identity, as well as shared a connection built over 20 years of riding bikes together. I'm not a bike rider, but I certainly hope that I'm compelled to have those kind of relationships and people in my life. So when the storms of cancer come, or the storms of heart disease come, or the storms of who knows what comes, I'll be able to find those people and say, you know what? I share life with you. And that life is important to share, especially through these storms. The third level of foundation is something that I guess to me is the most informative for many people, is this reality that when we care for our bodies, we're also caring for our mind. Think about that for a second. How can caring for your body help you deal with anxiety, whether it's clinical or just every day? Well, I want to tell you what I found in my life. I want to be very open with you, is that from a young age, as a teenager, I struggled with depression and anxiety, and I still do. And I remember finding that diagnosis so troubling in college that I was diagnosed with dysthymia. That's a form of depression that's a low-grade depression, but it continues to last over long periods of time. And what I found was that the best thing that I could do for my depression and anxiety was to exercise. Now, I've never been a huge weight guy, but I found that any physical exercise, whether it was walking, whether it was playing basketball, playing tennis, you name it, anything that exerted energy in my body seemed to help my dysthymia or my depression or anxiety lower. And what I found was the more that I just sat around and isolated myself, the higher my levels of depression and anxiety got. And so it's something in my life that I've learned is that when anxious times start happening, that's exactly the time when I need to look at, well, how am I taking care of my body? And to me, this could be multifaceted, and it's not an impetus for me to tell anybody you have to be perfect, but every little thing matters. Every little baby step can help. Maybe it's you find that you need to eat a little bit more healthy. Watch what you're eating when you're in an anxious period of time. Maybe you need to make sure that you're getting the right sleep. Maybe you need to make sure that you're drinking enough water. Maybe you need to make sure that you're making sure to take those walks, either in the morning or the afternoon or the evening, that are easy to put off, but when things are anxious, when the storm is hitting you, those are the times that you need it the most. Again, what I'm trying to get across here is that there is a synchronicity. Some people call it whole person health, is that our bodies are magnificent machines that are intertwined together, not just physically, but I'll also say emotionally, spiritually, is that those things are all tied together. So as I said before, this is something that's important when you look at how do I cope with anxiety? How do I build that foundation? It's not just one thing. It's not just getting to the right doctor, getting the right medicine, finding the right therapist, but it's also maybe examining spiritual things in your life, foundational principles of purpose, of trust. It's also forming connections in the community, meaningful relationships, not just the superficial ones, but people that you share life with. And it's also learning that these simple things that we always hear about, exercise and diet and water and rest and all those things, really can help us with our mental anxiety, not just the physical ones. The last one, and to me, this is something I'm passionate about. The reason I told you about my own struggle is that I think we need to do a better job normalizing seeking help. Is that this is something that we have to teach our kids. This is something that should be taught in churches, in temples, in synagogues. This should be something taught in schools, that it's okay to ask for help, especially with safe people. I'm not telling you to stand up at the top of the rooftop and say, I have anxiety. But maybe it is okay to go to people that you're close to and say, we need to talk because I'm feeling like maybe there's something in me that could be clinical. I've not been able to sleep because of anxious thoughts, or I feel like I've been feeling down. I've isolated myself over the past week, and my spouse is telling me that they're worried about me. I need to get help. The most painful thing for me to hear is to talk to people, both men and women, who are saying, I don't believe in that because it's not right. And again, this is what frustrates me as a pastor, is that sometimes we even have religious preoccupations that prevent people from getting help. And this to me is the most harmful, is when I hear religious people say, well, you just pray about it. Just pray about it and God will help. I could get into a big diatribe here about this, but I firmly believe that part of God's help is that he has provided people, both therapists as well as mental health providers, as well as physicians, to help people with the gifts and the knowledge to know how to help people deal with anxiety and depression and other things. So why should you doubt that God can work through the skills and the tools that he's given them? Maybe that's part of his answer to prayer. Normalize this with our kids. I think that you would be also shocked if you saw the things that I do in our society, looking at statistics of kids today that are experiencing unprecedented levels, at least self-reported levels, of anxiety. And it's easy to kind of just brush that off and say, well, they're just kids, they don't understand. Well, if you think about it, think of the pressures that our kids have today, brought on by social media and other things in the media and technology, is that they are struggling with anxious thoughts, anxious realities. They watch the news like any of us and see things happening in the world that's probably very easy for them to catastrophize and to feel, what's the purpose of life? Where am I going? Is it going to be safe? We need to let them know that it's okay to talk about what they're afraid of, including when they're anxious. Give them a safe environment and talk to them about the importance of building these foundations. That's part of helping people grow. As part of my closing here, I wanted to give you a couple things. I love this little Banksy quote and picture here. It says, if you get tired, learn to rest, not to quit. I love this picture. It was sent to me several months ago, but to me, I really grabbed onto this, is that For someone like me that tends to be a type A personality, likes to do, sometimes we have to learn that it's okay to take a rest, that we need to learn that it's okay to take a break. In fact, sometimes when we feel like we're quitting, the best advice we could receive is, have you just taken a break? Before you quit, just take a break and let your body rest, let your mind rest. As a Christian, I find interesting that in the book of Genesis, the beginning of the Bible, talking about the creation of this earth, here's an interesting text. It says, and on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. This is the seventh day of creation. And if you read this story, you find out that God intentionally designed a day of rest. And it's not just for God, but it's also for the people that he created. And to me, this is speaking of the rhythm of life that sometimes we've lost track of, maybe because of the influence of technology and always being connected, is that there is a natural rhythm of work and rest, work and rest. And what I find is that when we don't take those opportunities to rest, it's not surprising to see that our anxiety level tends to naturally increase. As much as we do, and sometimes that's the coping skill that some of us have to try to keep away those anxious thoughts. It's just, if I stay busy, won't think about this stuff. Because the reality is, the more you do without resting, the more those anxious thoughts, and again, the holistic picture of the more your body needs rest, the more your mind needs rest. The last thing I want to give you before we end here is this picture of storms. And this was a hurricane that hit over a decade ago up on the East Coast. And this is a picture of houses. And again, I can't tell if they're like the other house that I showed at the beginning. I can't tell if they have sand front foundations or if they have deeper ones. But it's a picture, again, of storms are going to come. Storms will happen in life. In fact, some of you probably have storms happening right now. Perhaps it's work. Perhaps it's a relationship. Perhaps it's health. Perhaps it's internal. Maybe it's external. The reality is we're always going to have storms. But the reality also is that we can have foundations in life that will enable us to withstand those storms. I remember a little song that I learned as a child, and it said, "The wise man built his house upon the rock." And I would pray for all of us is that wise people, men and women, is that we would be able to build our foundations on the rock, not on the sand. Thank you for being with us at this time, and I'll turn it back over to you, Amy.
Wow, Elliot, thank you so much. I think a lot of that hit home for me too. I know many of the comments over there, just I agree with all the above. Thank you for putting this on. I think sometimes we just need to rehear things sometimes a couple of times, or maybe multiple times, to really help us make steps forward.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for doing this workshop for us today. It was such a blessing. Thank you so much.
It's an honor.
Well, we do have some questions that we can go over to. There's so many thanks coming in the chat. So just thank you. If you want to check those out, you're more than welcome to. But let's go through some questions. Okay. I'm going to start at the top. So this is, let's see. There was one at the beginning. She asked, is it the same as disassociation? I think that was when you were kind of first talking about maybe the definition.
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's definitely a clinical picture where someone disassociates. They call it with reality. Is that the anxiety many times becomes so great that their mind, you would say, almost disconnects. And that usually comes with perhaps they become delusional. That's called dissociative personalities or dissociative disorders, where some people, again, that's a very serious clinical issue, where people are so anxious, those thoughts are so heavy in the mind, that's the coping skill that their mind produces, is I just disconnect from what's so anxious and I tend to live in a different reality. So that's part of it, but also somewhat different.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Someone also is asking, what's the difference between anxiety and depression?
Good question. As I said before, many times I would say that they're blended together. I know in my life and a lot of people's life is that what may initially be thought of as depression and diagnosable as depression, a clinical diagnosis, or is going to have overlapping it feelings of anxiety. In other words, it's not just the depressing thought of, oh, woe is me, the world is empty, the world has no purpose. But there's also anxious thoughts about, well, what am I going to do with work? I get anxiety about how I perform at work. Or perhaps there's other things in life that are very real that are causing me anxiety. So I would say they're the same, but they can be definitely treated differently. And again, I would talk about that with your doctor or perhaps the therapist, is that sometimes you can talk about and do things that address them both, but sometimes they need to be addressed differently, especially if you remember I talked about, is the anxiety internal or external? And once you identify those two things, you address those two things differently. If it's internal, you talk to a therapist and talk about those internal voices. If it's external, maybe you need to talk about looking at them differently or different ways to cope so they don't seem so overwhelming.
I love that exercise of just really taking a moment and where are these coming from?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great practical, just I can stop and then assess kind of where I'm at.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this person says, good morning from Washington. Do you play the guitar in the background?
Yeah, that's not just a hood ornament. That is actually a tool. And I would argue this is one of the coping skills that I have, is the music is something that I enjoy playing just for my own benefit. In other words, when things get anxious, what I do is I just go back there and pull it off the wall and I just play some songs. Now, I could use it for work. I enjoy playing for patients and for staff members and for churches and things like that. But it's also a tool that I found in my life helps me calm down. And we could certainly have another workshop talking about all the things and skills of producing peace in your life. And music is usually a very universal one, whether you play a song, play an instrument, or you just like listening to music.
Definitely one I use as well. It's a strong one for me. All right, Jennifer, she makes more of a little statement here, and I love this. I wish I was told this in college. A little exercise might have made a big difference in my anxiety and depression. And I love when she made this statement. You followed it up with, really we need to get this in all of these different places where we are at and where our loved ones are at, to really, make a change, and this being a very open discussion about different practical things that you can do.
Yes.
Which also follows up very well with Amber's comment here. She says, this is great. So many doctors these days want to prescribe antidepressants and never ask the questions about getting enough rest, exercise, etc. Finding kind of the root of the problem to get real help. And I think it's an overall system, kind of that whole health you were talking about. That's one of the things I love that we get to do with AIH and our grants, is trying to figure out how can we help these systems become more whole health oriented.
Yes. Treat the whole person. And again, I don't want to criticize someone prescribing medications. That certainly could be necessary, but again, it's not the only thing. There's other things that you need to add to the menu that could help people find healing.
Very true. All right, Susan asks, how do you find a new purpose in life? I have just finished homeschooling after doing it for 25 years. Not sure what to do next.
Good question, Susan. I would say you could either start with spending some time thinking about and kind of self-analyzing yourself. What are things you enjoy doing? What are things that give you a feeling of accomplishment when you do them? Now, again, you said you probably did that with your children. That was homeschooling, but maybe you have to analyze and go back before you homeschooled. What were the things that you enjoyed doing, whether it was work related or perhaps it was something you did for fun? I would also argue sometimes you can go ahead and skip to the second step and don't have to stay bogged down in the first one, because sometimes it's by engaging in community that help you find out what your purpose is. And so don't wait for the purpose before you engage with a community. And again, that community could be a number of different things. It could be a church, could be a social club, could be a bike club, as I mentioned. Something that you enjoy doing with people is usually the best place to start.
That's great. Thank you. Let's see. Zeta asked, so what kind of mental health provider help should they look for?
It's a good question.
What do you think?
Yeah, well, I say sometimes, and again, as a Christian, I would argue that some people want to find a Christian therapist. And that's a very natural thing that I hear. And there are certainly websites. Therapists are listed on all kinds of websites. So all you have to do is Google, and you can find people ascribing to a certain religious belief, as well as the skills or the behaviors that they specifically focus on. And so I would argue many times that's the best place to start, is online. If you don't want to do that, I would say probably the next best place is to perhaps talk to your medical provider. It's not terribly unusual if you go to your physician and just simply ask them, I'd like to see a therapist. Who would you recommend? Either they probably have a list, or perhaps their nurse practitioner or their PA or their nurse. In fact, sometimes that's the best way to find someone, is someone that you respect giving you a recommendation of somebody else. So I would start with those two things.
Very good. Let's see. Maricela asks, what is the best way to answer when someone who is anxious, not clinical, is asking for help and advice?
Well, I'd say usually the best thing you can do is listen. Is that maybe our first instinct is to try to answer and give them instructions or information. But for most people, it's simply they just need to vent. They just need to get that off their shoulders. And I would certainly argue that that's the first step. Maybe there's going to be other conversations where you talk about practical things of, have you thought about, or have you done this? But I would say the first step with anybody is always going to be, well, tell me about it. What's the thing that's causing you the most anxiety? And let them talk. And from that, maybe you'll get some information from them about maybe next steps that even they suggest.
Have a little bit of a coaching mentality there.
Yes.
You're really wanting to listen and be in the moment with them and be empathetic with them. And a lot of times, I agree, a lot of times people come up with their own solutions pretty easy and quickly.
Yeah.
All right, Anthony says, how do you counsel patients who notice areas of their life that are out of alignment with what they believe to be God's purpose for them in these areas, diet, organization, movement, etc., and feel continual anxiety over this disconnect, and yet struggle to improve these areas? Or they are strongholds? I'm gonna pop that question up for you so you'll be able to see it too.
Thank you. That's a good question.
I know it's kind of a long question, but that's a very good question.
Yeah, it is. And I think probably the first thing that jumps out to me is they're struggling with what they believe to be God's purpose. And I guess what initially jumps to my mind is the thought of maybe help them redefine who they think God is. And I think sometimes that's a scary question, but I think it's important for someone who says this is really important for them to know God's purpose, is help them to understand, well, who is it they believe God is? Because as you're talking here, I see that they feel anxiety because they're not doing the things they think they should do. And what that tells me is there's an internal anxiety that, oh, doggone it, I'm not good enough keeping my diet or my exercise. But perhaps there's also a doubt of saying, well, God must not be happy because I'm not doing the things that he wants me to do. And so it's a interrelated question of, who is God? Does he have grace enough for you that he allows these mistakes and you don't have to be anxious about that part of life? And then secondly, about your own failings and your own shortcomings, that has to do with, does God expect you to have all these things perfect? Is that what's going to have to be reached for you to have no anxiety? And I would talk to someone about, how realistic is that? We're always going to have failings. We're always going to have shortcomings. We're never going to be good enough, especially if we're a person of high levels of expectation on ourselves or others. So again, that's kind of reanalyzing, where do these judgments come from? Is that because of our picture of who God is or what he expects of us?
I think a lot of times it's kind of like that self-talk that we do, what we do with ourselves. A lot of times we don't give ourselves enough grace.
You're right. Right.
Yeah. All right. Chris says, I'm a senior with problems maintaining relationships, particularly since COVID. Any suggestions?
You're not alone. You're not alone. Trust me. I find that for everybody, no matter the age. I would encourage you to seek out, and again, usually it has to do with finding something that you enjoy doing and then asking around where there's a group of people doing that thing. And what's amazing is there probably is a group of people doing that thing somewhere, unless you're living way out around not a lot of people. Maybe that's a different thing, but there are so many groups, community groups and community centers in churches, just all over the place, that are just amazing to me when I find out there's a group for that. You know, whether it's stamp collecting, whether it's coin collecting, whether it's storytelling, whether it's knitting or crocheting or sports or activities. Those are usually the easiest things to find a group doing that together. And that to me is the easiest way to meet people, because you just naturally form relationships with people that like the same things you do. So I would encourage you to do that. Certainly faith is something that a lot of people have in common. So that's a matter of finding a religious gathering or a group of people your age that you can find are doing things, whether it's worship related or study related or tradition that you have had from your childhood. that's a way to connect with people as well.
Yeah. I feel like almost those relationships, like for example, for me, I used to always teach Zumba 3 nights a week, but then the gym still hasn't brought even their group exercise back. I so feel like I grieve over those relationships that I don't get to have, but I found new ones. But so I think one thing is it's not always, find those new ones and try different ones. One might not be the perfect fit, and trying multiples of those until you find something new that you're doing.
Yeah, good idea.
All right. How do you help a client with ruminating thoughts?
This is a question that has to do with cognitive therapy, something that I'm familiar with. And cognitive therapy is basically the process of helping people with those, as you said, Amy, the voices in their head. Is you track down what are those voices saying. And you very quickly can find patterns, and you help people identify what those patterns are. Is that they come to a problem and immediately get discouraged. Well, then you ask people to back up and you say, write down what are the things that you're thinking about. And you start helping them kind of analyze, where did that come from? Why do you think that way? And then it's a process of getting people literally to learn how to respond differently. And there's lots of really simple things. I know with kids, when I would talk with kids, is we would have little children wear rubber bands around their wrist. And what we would tell them was, we said, when you start getting angry and those thoughts start coming that you want to hurt somebody or, do something that you know is wrong, grab the rubber band and pop it against your wrist. In other words, that sensory kind of jolt helps you remember that, wait a second, I'm not going to think that way. I'm going to think this way. And that's kind of, again, reordering or restructuring your thoughts. And again, that's best done, I would argue, with a therapist or someone who's trained to do that, to help people walk through all those stories, all those narratives that are stuck in their mind, and they have to, literally like a record player, get a new track built in life so they're listening to something else.
All right. My 29-year-old daughter has Down syndrome and says she has been anxious and depressed. I did some research online this past weekend and read that this is often common with Down syndrome people. Are you aware of this, if this is actually a fact?
I'm not familiar if this is a fact, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was. Again, because what I indicated before is that there are many medical conditions that will have symptoms very similar to anxiety symptoms. And so, again, that's what sometimes is confusing, is that some people will look only at the medical side and say, oh, you're having racing heartbeat and you're having sweats. Well, that's because of your high blood pressure. Well, that could be true, but have you thought about the thoughts that have to do with anxious things? And is that something that needs to be addressed separately? And again, that's the important thing, is that you don't want to ignore the physical. In other words, you have to address the Down syndrome, the needs that have to do with that kind of situation. But perhaps there's anxiety that is a product of that situation. And I would argue a lot of times it's the same things of connections, feelings of isolation, feelings of purpose. I think that's something that we all have universal feelings in. And it's a process of helping someone kind of settle with, how can I find a purpose in my life with the limitations that I have? And that's going to be applied to someone with Down syndrome, as well as someone who is perhaps in a living situation where they're not as mobile as they used to be. Or as someone said, where you've been living one way, homeschooling for the last 24 years, and suddenly your life has changed because the kids are out of the house. You're going to have to re-examine, how do I find and re-identify my purpose?
Well, thank you so much, Elliot. And thank you, everyone, for all your wonderful questions.
Yes, thank you.
I kind of chime in with everyone here. Thank you so much for great practical things that we can do and just raising awareness of these different things. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And if you're looking for the recording of this, we will have it in your membership, as well as share it in your member email this next weekend. So have a great day, and we will see you all next time. Take care, Elliot. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.